In this lecture, we're going to create a C++ class. Now we need a class that we can use for our pawns. Now I'm saying pawns plural because there will be two different pawns in our game. There's going to be the tank that we use to roll around the level, and there's going to be a turret, which will be our enemy. So we can create a base pawn class, and this is going to have the basic functionality that both the tank and the turret will share. And this way, we can create our two child classes, the tank and the turret. So these are going to inherit qualities from the base pawn class. And these are things that both pawns are going to share, such as having the mesh, having a capsule component, and the ability to launch projectiles. Now, we're going to get into all those features in future videos. For this video, we're just going to create the C++ class and add some basic variables to it. So this is our motivation for creating our first C++ class. Now we're ready to start creating some C++ classes for this project. Now you'll see down here in the content browser that there are no folders for C++ classes. That's because we haven't created any just yet, but we're about to right now. So we can go up to File and select New C++ class, and here is where we're going to choose the parent class for the class that we're going to create. And by default, we have several options here to choose from. This is something that you should have seen in previous lectures. Now, we have some decisions to make here. For one, which parent class are we going to choose? We have the first one is none. That would basically allow us to create a plain old C++ class, but we're going to need some extra functionality. For one, we want to be able to place an instance of this object in the world. So we can't do that with a plain old C++ class. We could do that with a character or a pawn or an actor, but which one of these is most appropriate for what we want to do? Well, we need to take a step back and think about what exactly we're trying to create here. We're trying to create a tank that we can control and move around the level and shoot projectiles so that we can cause damage and all that good stuff. In our assets folder, just to remind us, we have this meshes folder here, and we have the tank base and we have the tank turret. These are two different meshes that are going to be in our class, and so we need the capability to have meshes. And so a plain C++ class does not have that ability. So let's think about this for a second. What parent class should we use? Well, the first class that should probably come to your mind is the actor class. Now, the actor class has the ability to be placed in the world, so that's a great start. It also has the ability to have a visual representation, whether that's a mesh or anything else. It can actually be seen once you place it in the world, provided that you give it a mesh or whatever it is that you want to see. Now, derived from actor, we have the pawn class, and the pawn inherits all of those qualities from the actor class, except it has additional qualities, such as the ability to be possessed by a controller. Now, this whole possession thing is something that we'll go into more detail about later, but for now, just understand that this means a pawn can be controlled by a player. So if you're pressing a mouse button or a keyboard key, this can be set up and configured so that we can move the pawn around. So this sounds like something that we would definitely want for our tank. So by handling movement input, the pawn is sounding like a pretty good choice. Now, derived from the pawn class and thus inheriting all the stuff that the pawn has, plus all the stuff that the pawn inherited from its parent class, we have the character class, which has some character-specific stuff. For example, it has something called a character movement component. Now, a pawn does not have this. A character movement component gives the character extra abilities, such as different movement modes like flying and swimming and crouching and other stuff specific to characters. The character class is good for bipedal characters, and it's not going to work very well for non-bipedal characters, things that are not creatures with two legs. And although it would be pretty awesome to have a tank flying around the level and dropping bombs on everything it sees, we're not going to do quite anything that complicated in this section. We're just going to make a tank that can roll around. So we really don't need a character movement component or any of that special character-specific stuff. So for this, I think a pawn is perfect for what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to challenge you to create a new C++ class. Create a class based on pawn and name this new class base pawn. Now you can leave all settings as is in the class creation wizard. You don't need to change the file path or anything like that. So pause the video and create your first C++ class for this project. So back here in the level, I'm going to go back to File and create new C++ class. I have not created the C++ class yet. I just closed out of this to go back to that slide. But now that I'm back, I'm ready to create my first C++ class for this project, and I'm going to choose Pawn. And you'll see that every time you hover over these, you've probably seen this before, we get a tooltip that pops up, and it says Pawn is the base class of all actors that can be possessed by players or AI. Now that sounds pretty exciting, but we are going to configure this to be movable by input from a player, so this is perfect. It goes on to say that they are the physical representations of players and creatures in a level. So in other words, once we create this tank, it's going to represent us as players in the world. Pretty cool. So select Pawn and click Next, and it's showing us the path where it's going to stick this class in our project. And you'll see that it's in source/toontanks. Now we're going to want to name our new pawn because my pawn is a horrendous name and it's very vague. We need something a little bit more specific. Now we're going to plan on using this as a base class, meaning we're going to derive classes from this class. So we can call this base pawn. Now I know that's not much better than my pawn, but hey, it's telling us that this is a base pawn. This is something we're going to derive child classes from in the future. We'll get to that. But for now, we're going to call this base pawn and we're going to click Create Class. Now after you've created a C++ class, you should go to File and refresh Visual Studio Code project, as Unreal Engine has stopped updating the project files automatically in 4.26. So this will ensure that the Visual Studio Code project gets refreshed and updated. All right, so Visual Studio Code has opened up for us with our new class. We have basepawn.h and basepawn.cpp. Now, we can close this sidebar by clicking the Explorer icon there, and we can take a look at what VS Code has generated for us. So by default, we get the class constructor, as well as 3 functions: begin play, tick, and setup player input component. Now you should be familiar with begin play and tick. The comments here explain what they do. Setup player input component is something that the pawn gets, and this function allows us to handle input, such as from a keyboard key or a mouse click, and we'll learn more about how this works in future videos. In basepawn.cpp, these functions are defined for us, but they're pretty bare, and we'll change that in future videos as well. So in this video, we created our first C++ class. In the next video, we'll discuss components and why we would like to add some to our new class. I'll see you soon.